Alrighty guys, hello and welcome back to the show. So today we're going to be looking at T1 air versus T3 and experimental air units. A couple of you guys have been really asking me to do this particular video. A lot of you guys really like the tech tier mismatch kind of videos where we stack tech 2 units up against tech 3, tech 1 versus tech 2, etc, etc, etc. Today we're going to be doing tech 1 air versus tech 3 air, tech 4 air. So let's get into it. Now, so we've all been in this scenario before where you're playing front on a game like, or a map like Open Wonder, Canis, Settons, Hilly Plateau, insert whatever map you would like that has more of a dedicated air slot, and you find yourself being besieged by T3 air. So I'm not going to get as much into the numbers here, mostly because things can get infinitely complicated depending on how many air factories both players have, whether the air player built a T3P gen versus whether they didn't, or just rushed ASF. And I'm not going to be taking into account the mass investment to upgrade to T3, which is roughly 3,880 mass total between T1 versus T3. T1 going to T2 headquarters and T2 going to T3 headquarters. So I'm not going to be taking that into account. And the reason is really for the first disclaimer. I'm making this video from the perspective of a front player on one of those maps that we mentioned earlier, where as a front player, you should build a few interceptors at the beginning of the game. You should have an air factory building a couple of interceptors so that your air player can focus on teching, upgrading, etc. Whether that be mercy snipes at their Aeon, whether it just be gaining air superiority through ASF. As a front player, you should be building at least a few of your own interceptors, like 5, 10, something like that, to be able to deal with T2 gunship rush or mercy snipe or something like that from another air player. Trust me, your air player will thank you if you invest a little bit of resources into building interceptors. But what happens if your air player doesn't really know what they're doing and you're stuck with T1 air and trying to deal with T3 air incursion? So the second disclaimer here is T1 will win actually every single time if you normalize for upgrades to T3. And sometimes even if you don't normalize for those upgrades, T3 air will win every single time. So for instance, if you take 2 ASF and normalize it with interceptors, the interceptors will win a couple of times. Just due to the way that the AI actually moves. Whenever you put micro in there, it all goes out the window. The ASF will absolutely crush the interceptors. But so those two disclaimers that we're working on here, that we're working from here, because in reality, if you're a dedicated air player, you really should not just be spamming T1 air. You really should be trying to tack and upgrade to T2 or T3 air as quickly as possible. So I want to look at this from a more realistic scenario instead of just if an air player decides to meme and build 20 T1 air factories and crank interceptors into the field. So the question is, can you hold off the oncoming swarm, or are you ultimately screwed? So the first one we're going to be looking at is the T3 air player that is your opponent, or not your direct opponent, but on the enemy team, has cranked out a couple of ASF and is looking to gain air superiority, whereas your air player might be a little bit behind. Maybe they got harassed early by land or something like that. So unsurprisingly here, your interceptors are going to be pretty useless. In several tests I ran with Kappa, there was never really a time where interceptors matching mass for mass were able to get the drop on ASFs if you had micro. If you let the AI kind of control the units under attack move, there were a handful of times where the interceptors would come out on top, but there's not really a great answer here for ASFs. Really, the only way that this ends up working out is if the ASFs are doing literally nothing and you can take out a few of them on the ground before they're actually able to take off and start shooting back. That's really the only kind of win scenario here. So the second one is going to be gunships. So flipping the coin here, let's say instead of going for ASFs or air superiority, your opponent went for gunships instead to snipe enemy ground players, which is again a pretty viable strategy. So stacking up interceptors versus restorers, unsurprisingly, the interceptors actually win if you're mass normalized. So if you mass normalize and take 24, I believe, restorers, or 24 interceptors, I'm sorry, and stack them up against one restorer, the interceptors are going to absolutely crush the restorer. But if you add 2 or 3 restorers into the mix, and you still have the same 24 interceptors, which is again a pretty realistic scenario where if you're a front player, you're going to shut down your air factory at some point so that you can start focusing on teching your land. Or at the very least, you're going to keep your air factory producing interceptors, but 24 is a pretty reasonable, 24 to 30, 20 to 30 interceptors is a pretty reasonable amount for a player with one T1 air factory cranking interceptors for the first 15 to 20 minutes of the game, whenever the scenario might come around. It's a pretty reasonable number for them to have. Having 3 or 4 restorers, though, is going to absolutely crush the entire Air Force. Now, restorers are something like a worst case scenario here on the gunship side, just because they do about 71 damage per second, whereas something like a broadsword is only going to do 12 damage per second in an anti-air engagement. And interceptors do fare relatively well against broadswords and whalers, but that's something that you just have to keep in mind as far as who the enemy air player is. If they're going for restorers, you're going to be in a pretty bad position there. So next, moving on to strategic bombers. Strat bombers are much faster than interceptors. They have anti-air, or at least the Ambassador and the Revenant do, but it's nothing really of consequence. So really all the strategic bomber needs to do is make it through your initial fighter screen, and then it will just outrun your interceptors, taking out power generators, mass extractors, whatever seems to really be on the menu. And credit to Guilecast actually for what you guys are seeing on the screen right now. This is a cast that I watched even before I started playing. I watched Guile for probably about 1.5 years before I actually started playing Supreme Commander, just because I like real-time strategy casting, and Guile's a great caster. But this little clip here is where the enemy air player went for a super early strat at like 12-13 minutes, was able to make it through the initial interceptor fighter screen, and you've just got like a train of interceptors following the strategic bomber as it's moving through the enemy bases, taking out mexes and power generators, etc. So really the only way that you can stop this is if you have enough interceptors in your initial fighter screen to make a one pass at the strat. Otherwise, even if the strat has like a little bit of health, if you have no AA in your base, it's gonna absolutely decimate your base and the base of your allies as it moves and flies throughout the map. So next, we have experimentals. So experimentals, we tested the Awasa, the Czar, and the Soulripper as airborne experimentals. So starting off with the Awasa, like the strategic bomber, is much faster than the T1 interceptors. But if you can get a handle on it, and I spawned in 100 interceptors to test this out, which is kind of an obscene amount. If you can get a handle on it with 100 interceptors, then you can kill it, and you'll have about 40-ish remaining. But this is assuming there's no ASF supporting the Awasa, and it also means that the Awasa is basically just doing like pirouettes in place and letting the interceptor shoot it, which in reality, if you have a player that has built an Awasa, they're going to be microing it. They're going to be, dropping a bomb, moving on, dropping another bomb, unless they're hover bombing. So, I mean, I guess if they're hover bombing, then 100 interceptors, if you have that available to you, is enough to actually take out the Awasa. Moving on to the Czar. The Czar absolutely shreds interceptors. So even with 100 interceptors, you can only do about 5k damage to the Czar's shields. In my tests, this was actually Sergeant Syphilis that helped me out with these tests. Shout out to Sarge. But there will be about 50 interceptors that die even before they get to the Czar's main body. And because if you take your interceptors and right click them on a Czar, this is actually true for ASF as well, so keep this in mind. But if you tell your interceptors to attack a Czar directly, they will fly directly through the Czar's devastating beam that is firing downwards, and that will kill air units. So that's something to even keep in mind if you're countering a Czar with ASF, which is what you should be doing. So about 50 of them were killed before they got to that point, and then the other 50 got decimated by the beam as they were actually flying through for a second pass. So interceptors are not a viable counter to the Czar unless you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them available to you, but just because the Czar's missiles are AoE and the beam is going to absolutely shred any aircraft that fly through it. Okay, moving on to the last one. So the Soulripper is not able to handle 100 interceptors, really, no matter how you actually play it out. The bug does not have great AA. That's really not why you build a Soulripper. So I wanted to test this out because it is an experimental air unit, but 100 interceptors will be able to deal with a bug in actually relatively short order. Just because the bug does not have great AoE, it doesn't have AoE, it doesn't have great AA. Gosh, I wish I could speak. And it doesn't have AoE AA like the Czar. It also doesn't have good enough speed like the Awasa to actually run away. So really all I can do is just kind of sit there and take it. So if you're controlling the Soulripper and somebody pops out with 100 interceptors, you need to have some ASF supporting that Soulripper. And if you're the interceptor guy and you see a Soulripper and you've somehow got 100 interceptors available at your disposal, go right to it. You'll be able to take out the Soulripper. So we'll wrap the video there, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this. This one was a little bit less of a sciencey video in the fact that I didn't go through as many statistics and everything, just because the statistics are going to convolute this a lot. Where if you're a front player on Hilly Plateau or Canis, it is really not reasonable for you to expect to mass normalize aircraft with an opposing air player. This is more meant to illustrate what you can do and kind of where you're just a little bit SOL if the enemy air player shows up with T3 air. So when to fight, when to run away, when to build ground-based AA, etc. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I know I had a hell of a lot of fun making this video, and a shout out to both Kappa and Sarge for helping me with the micro in this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.